So the last couple of years have been very interesting for people that grew up during the 90s. And I would like to think that I don't look like I did, but I did grow up during the 90s. So a few years ago, people might recall this, they had a break in the Tupac Shakur case. Maybe one of the great mysteries of the 1990s, who killed Tupac Shakur. A couple years ago, they seemed to think that they had found the answer. And now more recently, they haven't really so much solved what some people considered a mystery as actually reopened it. There was a forensic team that re examined the evidence related to the death of Kurt Cobain. And they turned around and they said, we think that this is not just a homicide. They said that we think that this is a pretty textbook homicide. And ever since the death of Kurt Cobain, there has been something of a cottage industry of people that would insist that no, he didn't kill himself, that in fact he was murdered. Now, I'm not going to say that I'm a full blown believer in the theory that Kurt Cobain was murdered. I mean, I've read the book. I've read the book, Who Killed Kurt Cobain, and the sequel, Love and Death. So I do understand all of the theorizing behind this idea that he was in fact murdered. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm a full-blown believer in that. Now, however, nor really am I a full-blown non-believer in it. And even if I were a full-blown non-believer in it, I would definitely understand exactly why it is that people would not want to accept the idea that Kurt Cobain had killed himself. For people of, in the words of Fred Durst, my generation, my generation, it was a very devastating blow when Kurt Cobain died. And I would suggest that for some particular subcultures, in the youth of my generation, I probably shouldn't do that. I think that Kurt Cobain would probably be pissed off if he heard me making references to Fred Durst in a video that's actually, it's about him. So I'm going to stop doing that. But within a particular subculture, and in fact one that I was actually not really so far removed from, it was very close to my social circle, between Kurt Cobain's death and Brandon Lee's death, and a few others, really it was kind of like there was this fixation with dying young amongst that particular age group, that particular subculture. That endured for a really long time. As a matter of fact, I would suggest maybe with some of them, he maybe even endures, right up until today. And so with that in mind, I think that I understand why people wouldn't want to think that Kurt Cobain had willingly done this with his own hand, that somebody else had to be involved in it. I understand that desire. Now, at the same time, do I firmly believe it, that he didn't kill himself? Well, I'll put it to you this way. I don't really believe that he didn't do it, strongly enough to, just come out and flat out say it. But I suppose that I believe that he didn't strongly enough that I do have a theory. And that's what I'm going to share with you in this video here today. I'm going to share with you a theory that I had postulated about the death of Kurt Cobain. It brings together a lot of the various facts that were associated with his death. Little things like a lot of people thought that his suicide note was not completely written in his own hand. And that there was enough language in that note that seemed to infer to a lot of people that in fact what the note was about was that he was going to go and get help with his drug problems, and try to solve his personal problems, and that he was prepared to leave Courtney Love in order to do that. Now, I should note Courtney Love, just in case you've been, living under a rock for like 30 years, was the lead singer of another Seattle area grunge band by the name of Hole, and she was Kurt Cobain's wife. Feel like I should have mentioned that a little bit earlier, but I forgot to, so I'm just going to drop it in there now. So as with a lot of rock stars, Kurt Cobain had a pretty tumultuous relationship with his spouse, Courtney Love. And Courtney Love was kind of known to be a lot more aggressive than Kurt Cobain was and a lot more ambitious than Kurt Cobain was. Kurt Cobain, he loved to make music. But Courtney Love, it's kind of said that she didn't really love to make music as much as he did, but she did kind of want to rule the world. And so one dynamic that was said to be present in their relationship was that Courtney Love was a little bit of a control freak. And it was actually every bit as true within her band as it was within her marriage. And at times it made it very difficult for her to hold the band together. You know, she had Eric Erlandson was the guitarist, and he was very loyal to Courtney Love. But the other band members, they could just kind of, but at times they could come and they could go. And as a matter of fact, by the time that Kurt Cobain was getting into the last days of his life, Courtney Love had actually already lost one bass player in the band. Her original bass player had departed and been replaced by a woman by the name of Kirsten Paff. And so Kirsten Paff, she had kind of she was a university educated musician. And the band had kind of just been viewed as a lot of people in her life as something that had kind of just like drug her down into just these terrible depths of despair. She was having drug problems and such. And eventually she decided that she was going to leave the band. And she wasn't just going to leave the band. She was going to leave Seattle, and she was going to move to Minnesota. She was going to get off of the junk, and she was going to go back to school and finish her degree and then move on with the rest of her life. But Courtney Love, some say, okay, hold on, I should preface all of this. Some say that Courtney Love was not terribly keen to let her bass player go. And so it is said, although in the long run it turns out that Courtney Love didn't really have very much choice in the matter, because Kirsten Paff, very quickly after making the decision that she was going to leave Hole, she wound up dead. And a lot of people found that it was very suspicious. As a matter of fact, so much so that it is said, there is a story that is told, that Eric Erlandson was seen leaving Kirsten Paff's apartment on the very night before she was ready to move back to Minnesota. Eric Erlandson had come to visit her at her apartment, and he was seen leaving via the fire escape. Kind of an odd way to leave a building. You see that in movies. Sometimes you see that in even bad fiction. But it's not what people would consider to be a very common way to leave a building, to say the least of it. So Eric Erlandson was seen leaving the building via the fire escape. And the next morning, Kirsten Paff is found dead. The cause of death is ruled to be basically acute drug toxicity, drug poisoning, an overdose, more specifically heroin. The theory that a lot of people developed was that Eric Erlandson had been sent by Courtney Love to go and give Kirsten Paff a hot shot of heroin to make sure that she stayed addicted, in the belief that if she could keep Kirsten Paff addicted, then she would have to stay in the band. And Courtney Love would be able to maintain control over her and maintain control of her band, and continue with her agenda of conquering the world through music. Now, that's never been proven. The Kirsten Paff death is basically being ruled an accidental overdose. Although usually, not very many drug addicts tend to pass away in their own homes, from an overdose. Typically that has a lot to do with the way that the brain processes things when a person uses a lot of drugs in their own home. When they go to the place where they tend to do their drugs, the brain starts to gets the body ready to receive drugs. And typically when a drug user overdoses, they overdose in a place that's strange to them. So for Kirsten Paff to overdose in her own home, it is a mite bit strange in a lot of respects. And so now what we do is we take this particular story and we fast forward a couple of months, 2 months, precisely 2 months. Well, maybe not precisely 2 months, approximately 2 months about. And then what happens? Well, Kurt Cobain is found dead, in his home, in the attic of his home, age 27 years old. The official cause of death is registered as a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the face. Basically, he shot himself in the head with a shotgun. Horrible way to go out. And now this forensic team is starting to challenge that, and they're saying that, well, we're not convinced that he was alone in the room when he was shot. We're not even necessarily convinced that the shotgun was the principal means of his death. And so that's very interesting. Because for a lot of years, what a lot of people said was that with the amount of heroin that was in Kurt Cobain's bloodstream when he was found dead, they said that it should have been impossible for him to be able to even, he should have been unconscious, let alone should he have been able to shoot himself in the head with a shotgun. There have been some people who have disputed that, though, and they've recorded instances of people with much higher content in their blood, photographed doing things like standing on one leg and things like that. Although other people do note that apparently these photos are of methadone users, which I've been led to understand is a little bit different than heroin. Don't ask me to explain how. I'm not a doctor. I'm not necessarily an expert in that. I'm just recounting what was told. And so then based on all of that information, I think that maybe you have to conclude that it is actually very likely that no, Kurt Cobain could not actually have shot himself in the head with that shotgun. I think that is probably, based on the facts of this case, I think that is probably the most likely scenario. Well, so then now you have to ask yourself this question, like how did it happen? And so this was the theory that I postulated. Keep in mind, I'm only saying that this is a theory. I'm not saying that this is true. I'm not even necessarily saying that I believe this to be true or that you should believe this to be true. It's just a theory that I came up with. And you can feel free to tell me what you think about it. But I have a theory. And it actually rests quite largely on one particular detail about Courtney Love. And that is that I honestly do not think that Courtney Love is a person that learns her lesson, and I don't think that she's the kind of person that learns from her mistakes. And so you take this in mind where you have this theory, where she sent her guitarist, Eric Erlandson, to go and give this Kirsten Paff a hot shot of heroin to keep her addicted, keep her in the band, and keep her under control. And that goes badly. But does Courtney Love learn from her mistakes? No, she doesn't. So then, a couple of months later, when her husband is getting ready to leave her, quit music, at least for the time being, get clean, get out from under her control, well, what does a control freak do in that kind of a situation? Well, obviously, they do something, they make a move to try to maintain control of a person. But in the case of Courtney Love, she kind of needs to maintain control over him. I mean, in a large respects, he's largely responsible for the success of her career as a musician. And really, her band didn't really accomplish nearly as much after Kurt Cobain was dead as they did before, when he was still alive to kind of help them get by. So then what does a control freak who doesn't learn from her mistakes do in this particular situation? Well, she repeats the mistake. So she sends somebody to the home, maybe even Eric Erlandson himself, maybe, but we don't know that. And she does the same thing all over again. Goes over, gives him a hot shot of heroin, and then when he overdoses and dies, well, now he needs some way to cover this up. I mean, an accidental overdose maybe could explain this happening in such close to proximity to Courtney Love once. But I don't think it necessarily explains it twice. So now you need a different explanation for the cause of death. And it just so happens to be very convenient that Kurt Cobain does have guns in the home. So then what do? Well, you engineer the appearance of a suicide. So I suppose that what somebody might do is they might take that shotgun, place it in the hands of the victim in this case, discharge a round. Now it looks like a suicide. And maybe you even finish an uncompleted letter to make it appear more like a suicide note than what the rest of it appears to. And boom, right there. Suddenly you have your suicide. Suddenly you have your Kurt Cobain, and now you have cast a pall of darkness over an entire generation of teenagers. Now, I'm not entirely sure that that's the direction that this team, this forensic team, wants to go in with their reopened investigation into the death of Kurt Cobain. Really, that's just my theory. But one thing that I think that we can expect now, I mean, with this particular news story breaking, is I think that we can look forward to seeing, the reemergence of this cottage industry of theories about whether or not Kurt Cobain had actually killed himself or whether or not he was murdered. I mean, I think it's fair to say that probably this video is definitely a part of that cottage industry now, isn't it? Now, one thing I suppose that I should take a minute and mention is that if you happen to find this theory interesting enough that you'd actually like to discuss it, discuss it with other people, one thing that you will definitely have to do with this video is make sure that you like, share, subscribe, and repost this. Just something that typically I hate to do, and it just feels cynical, to ask for somebody to do that on a video about this topic. But one story that I had been kind of intending to share, and I'll share it kind of briefly. And it kind of goes back to when I made some recent videos about the passing of Chris Benoit. And I also kind of shared some different theories that I have in relation to that. I got a very interesting email from Google telling me that they were going to age restrict that because of the subject that I was talking about. Oh, and they also sent me a very, very kind and impersonal, very kind, impersonal email telling me that they were worried about my mental state on account of me discussing these topics. So I kind of actually entirely think that this video is going to be age restricted. I don't mind that, actually. I don't mind that they would age restrict it. I think that this is probably a subject that little kids don't need to be, don't need to be consuming at their age. So that's fair. I don't mind that. I think that what I really disliked was the way that they throttled the availability of that video. And they will probably do it again with this video, when really it's talking about an issue that is vital that we discuss it. This is an incredibly important topic, from the subject of awareness. The odds that any one person is going to know somebody that is going to choose to exit the world in that way are not nearly as remote as we would hope. And so I think that it is actually an incredible disservice to the public to throttle anybody that just, to throttle the content of anybody who just happens to talk about these subjects. Because one way or another, we need to talk about them. And we really need to get out of this practice of trivializing it by surrounding it with all of these cutesy little euphemisms that people use these days, like self-deletion and things like that. Which is why, I am going to take a little bit of a stand here. And it's definitely not going to play out in my favor. But I'm going to take a stand on this, and I'm going to discuss this openly, and I'm not going to surround it with all of these little euphemisms. I think it's such an important public service, so we discuss these things, that I will happily take the kick from the algorithm. YouTube can deboost my content for however long they feel like they want to. I don't really care. I'm not shying away from these subjects. I'm not going to do it. And if this sudden care from YouTube about my mental state as I discuss these subjects is at all genuine, I am pretty sure that you guys do have enough information that you guys could actually reach out to me directly instead of sending me like a very cold and indifferent email about the subject.